My father looked me dead in the eye at Sunday dinner and told me to pack my children's bags and move into the unfinished basement. He said my younger brother deserved our bedrooms more for his new baby. What he did not realize was that I had just spent $100,000 saving the very roof over his head. I did not cry. I did not argue. I just smiled, knowing I was about to legally evict the man who raised me. My name is Maya, and I am 34 years old. If you have ever been the family workhorse, while someone else was the golden child, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe toxic family members deserve exactly what is coming to them. The scent of collard greens, baked macaroni and cheese, and candied yams filled the air of my parents' historic Atlanta brownstone. It was our traditional Sunday dinner, a weekly event that was supposed to represent family unity. From the outside, anyone looking through the large bay windows would see the perfect picture of success. My father, Calvin, was a prideful 62-year-old church elder who wore his tailored suits like a suit of armor. He commanded respect in our community. People looked at him and saw a man of faith, a pillar of the neighborhood. But inside these brick walls, the reality was a suffocating hierarchy, where I was always placed at the very bottom. I sat at the long mahogany dining table, carefully cutting a piece of warm cornbread for my 8-year-old daughter, Nia. Beside her, my 12-year-old son, Malik, ate quietly. My children knew the unspoken rules of this house. They knew to be seen and not heard, especially when their grandfather was holding court. Across the table sat my younger brother Darius. He was 30 years old, proudly unemployed, and perpetually chasing the next big cryptocurrency scheme that was supposed to make him a millionaire overnight. Beside him was his wife Tasha, 29 years old, and draped in designer logos that I knew for a fact were purchased on credit cards she could not afford to pay off. We were halfway through the meal when the atmosphere in the room abruptly shifted. My father reached out and clinked his heavy silver fork against his crystal water glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low murmur of conversation. Everyone stopped eating. I set down my knife, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Whenever Calvin clinked his glass, it meant an official family announcement was coming, and those announcements rarely meant anything good for me. I expected a prayer of thanksgiving, or perhaps a boastful toast about his latest achievement at the church committee. Instead, he folded his hands heavily on the table, looked directly into my eyes, and delivered a command that made the air leave my lungs. Maya, he began, his voice carrying that booming, authoritative tone he usually reserved for the pulpit. You and the kids need to start packing your belongings tonight. By tomorrow morning, I want you moved out of the second-floor bedrooms and down into the basement. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. The basement of the brownstone was completely unfinished. It was a dark, drafty concrete box that flooded during the heavy Atlanta rainstorms. It had no proper heating, no drywall-exposed insulation hanging from the ceiling rafters, and certainly no safe place for 2 young children to live. Move to the basement. I repeated, my voice barely a whisper as I looked at my children. Dad, the basement is not even livable. There is no insulation down there. The air is damp. Why would we move out of our rooms? Darius leaned back in his chair, a smug, entitled grin spreading across his face. He wrapped his arm around Tasha, who was dramatically rubbing her barely visible pregnant belly. Because Tasha and I are expecting a boy, Darius announced, proudly puffing out his chest. The first male grandson, the heir to the family name. We are going to need the entire second floor to create a master nursery and a private suite for ourselves. We need the space, Maya. You have to clear out. I stared at my brother in absolute disbelief. Darius had lived in this house his entire life, completely rent-free. He had never held a steady job for more than 6 months at a time. He had never contributed a single dime to the utility bills, the expensive groceries, or the endless maintenance of this beautiful but aging historic home. And now, he was demanding that my children and I be banished to a concrete cellar so he could have a sprawling private suite for a baby that was not even born yet. I looked to my father, desperately expecting him to be reasonable. Surely he would not subject his own grandchildren to those living conditions just to cater to a whim. But Calvin's face was completely devoid of sympathy. He looked at me with cold, hard calculation. "Your brother is right," Calvin said firmly, adjusting his posture. "This house is the ultimate legacy of our family. Darius is my only son, and he is carrying on the family name. He needs an environment that reflects his status as the man of his own household. You are just a single mother, Maya. You do not need 2 bedrooms. You can make it work downstairs." The sheer audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow. The absolute disrespect for my children and the blatant favoritism for his useless son was suffocating. But what truly ignited the fire in my chest was the overwhelming hypocrisy of the entire situation. They were sitting in chairs I bought, eating food I paid for inside a house I had literally rescued from the brink of destruction. I dropped my fork onto my ceramic plate. It landed with a loud, sharp clatter that made Tasha flinch and pull her designer bag closer to her chest. "My status?" I asked, my voice steadying into a cold, hard tone that I rarely used. "Let us talk about status, Dad. Let us talk about exactly what happened 6 months ago in this very room." Calvin's jaw tightened instantly. "Do not raise your voice at my table, Maya," he warned. "I am not raising my voice," I said, leaning forward and planting my hands on the table. "I am reminding you of facts. 6 months ago, you sat in that exact chair and cried. You told me the roof was collapsing, the plumbing was rusted completely through, and Fulton County was preparing to foreclose on this precious family legacy because you had secretly accumulated years of back taxes that you could not pay." Darius shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting nervously toward our father. Tasha stopped rubbing her belly and stared at her plate. I looked right into my father's eyes, refusing to back down. "I handed you a cashier's check for $100,000. $100,000 of my hard-earned money in pure cash. I paid off your debt. I fixed your roof. I replaced your plumbing. I saved this house from the bank. And you are sitting here telling me to pack my children's clothes and move to a wet concrete floor so your unemployed son can have a luxury master suite." The dining room descended into a heavy, toxic silence. For a brief second, I thought I saw a flash of genuine shame in my father's eyes, but it was quickly swallowed by his massive, fragile ego. He could never admit to being wrong, especially not in front of his golden child. Tasha rolled her eyes and let out a loud, mocking sigh, breaking the silence. "Oh, here we go with the money talk again," she sneered, examining her manicured nails. "You always have to hold everything over people's heads, Maya. You helped your father. That is what a good daughter is supposed to do. It is about legacy. But you would not understand that. You are just a divorced single mom. You are lucky they even let you stay here at all. You need to know your place." I looked at Tasha, a woman who was currently wearing a Gucci belt she bought while dodging collection calls from her credit card company. She was sitting in a house I had literally saved, eating food I had paid for, and telling me to know my place. My son Malik reached under the table and grabbed my hand. His small fingers were trembling. He was 12 years old, old enough to understand exactly how much his grandfather and uncle disrespected his mother. Nia was staring down at her lap, her cornbread completely forgotten, her eyes welling with tears. I squeezed my son's hand, silently promising him that this would be the last time anyone in this room ever made him feel unwanted. Calvin slammed his fist on the dining table, rattling the crystal glasses and spilling water onto the fine tablecloth. "Tasha is right," he thundered, his face turning a deep shade of red. "You threw that money in my face the moment you had the chance. That $100,000 was nothing but back pay. It was payment for all the years I put food in your mouth and a roof over your head when you were growing up. You owe me that money. I do not owe you a master bedroom." He stood up and pointed a long, accusatory finger toward the front hallway. "If you are not willing to support your brother, and if you are going to disrespect the hierarchy of this family, then you can pack your bags and get out of my house. Tonight." They all looked at me, waiting for me to break. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for forgiveness, to accept the dark basement, to apologize for bringing up the money. That was the role they had assigned me since I was a little girl. The strong black woman who took the abuse, paid the bills, and stayed quiet to keep the peace. But I was not that little girl anymore. I was a highly successful cybersecurity consultant who had spent years protecting massive corporate networks from hostile takeovers. I knew how to build an impenetrable fortress, and I knew exactly how to set a fatal trap. I slowly stood up from the table. I picked up my cloth napkin, wiped my mouth with deliberate slowness, and placed it neatly next to my plate. "Come on, kids," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "We are leaving." Calvin crossed his arms, a victorious, arrogant smirk settling on his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully asserted his dominance and secured the entire house for his golden child. He thought I was leaving with nothing but the clothes on my back and a broken heart. What my arrogant father, my foolish brother, and his greedy wife did not know was the secret behind that $100,000 cashier's check. I did not just give my father the money to pay off the bank. I was the bank. But I decided to let them enjoy their dinner tonight. Let them celebrate their imaginary nursery. Let them think they were royalty in a castle they owned. They were about to learn a very brutal lesson about property rights. I stood there holding my children by their hands, my chair pushed back from the table. We were inches away from walking out of the dining room when my mother finally decided to speak. Brenda was 60 years old and prided herself on being the ultimate peacemaker of the church congregation. She wore her Sunday best, a tailored lavender suit, and sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. For my entire life, her version of keeping the peace meant forcing me to swallow my pride so that the men in the family could inflate theirs. "Maya, sit back down and stop acting so dramatic," my mother said. Her voice was smooth-coated in that sickeningly sweet tone she used to manipulate situations. "You know your father means well. He just wants the best for his grandson. And you are a strong black woman, Maya. You always figure it out." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. There it was, the ultimate trap. The phrase my family had weaponized against me since I was a teenager. Being a strong black woman in this family did not mean I was respected. It meant I was the designated mule. It meant I was expected to carry the emotional, physical, and financial burdens of everyone else without ever asking for a single thing in return. It meant I was supposed to endure abuse, with a smile absorb financial ruin, without complaint, and step aside so my brother could shine. When Darius wrecked his first car, I was the strong one who had to co-sign his next auto loan. When my parents fell behind on their credit cards, I was the strong one who had to empty my savings to bail them out. "Darius needs this win." "Maya," my mother continued, her eyes pleading with me to just surrender and play my part. "He is finally stepping up to be a father. He needs to feel like the head of the household. A baby changes everything. Why are you being so selfish over a few rooms? Just let him have the second floor. You and the kids will be perfectly fine in the basement. You always make a home out of nothing." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. I looked at her perfectly styled hair and her expensive pearls, completely blind to the reality of what she was asking me to do. "The basement has exposed fiberglass insulation hanging from the ceiling," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly across the quiet dining room. "It has no central heating. It floods every time it rains heavily in Atlanta. Malik has asthma, Mom. The dampness and mold down there would send him to the emergency room in a week. You are asking me to put your grandchildren in a hazardous, unfinished cellar so that Darius and his wife can have a walk-in closet for a baby that is not even here yet." "It is not a cellar," Tasha scoffed, rolling her eyes and tossing her long weave over her shoulder. "It just needs a little paint and maybe a space heater. You have money. You can hire a contractor to fix it up for your kids. Do not act like we are throwing you in a dungeon." I ignored Tasha completely. My focus remained entirely on my parents. If I am no longer welcome to sleep in the bedrooms of the house I just saved from foreclosure, I said, my voice hardening into steel, then I want my $100,000 back. Right now. You can take out a bank loan, or Darius can use his imaginary cryptocurrency fortune to pay me out. But if you are kicking my children out of their beds, I want every single cent returned to my account by tomorrow morning. The air in the room grew dangerously thick. Calvin's face morphed from arrogant smugness to absolute fury. He slammed his heavy fist onto the dining table with such force that the silverware rattled against the fine china. "You demand money from me!" Calvin roared, half rising from his chair. His chest heaved with indignation. You stand in my house eating my food and demand money from your own father. It is my money, I shot back, instantly refusing to flinch. I gave it to you to save this house from the tax auction. It was not a gift to fund a luxury suite for Darius. That money was back pay, Calvin shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. It was nothing but back pay for all the food, the shelter, the clothes, and the electricity I provided for you growing up. You owed me that money for the privilege of being raised in this house. You were an ungrateful burden then, and you are an ungrateful burden now. I stood frozen, letting the sheer absurdity of his words wash over me. My father was literally retroactively billing me for my childhood. He was charging his own daughter for the basic legal necessities of parenting, using it as a justification to steal $100,000 from my bank account. It was a level of financial and emotional abuse so profound that it bordered on delusion. He honestly believed that simply doing the bare minimum required by law as a parent entitled him to rob me blind as an adult. He had never asked Darius for a dime of back pay. Darius, who had totaled 3 cars my parents bought for him. Darius, who had dropped out of college twice and left my mother to pay off his student loans. Darius, who had lived rent-free in his childhood bedroom for 3 decades without ever holding a mop or paying a water bill. Right on cue, the golden child decided to interject. Darius leaned back in his chair and aggressively adjusted the heavy gold Rolex on his left wrist. I recognized that watch immediately. I knew for an absolute fact that my mother had secretly drained her retirement account to buy it for his 30th birthday, because he claimed he needed to look successful to attract high-level investors for his latest app idea. Look, Maya, you need to chill out and stop ruining my celebration, Darius said, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. You are making this whole dinner toxic. Tasha and I are trying to enjoy a beautiful moment with the family. You deciding to throw a massive temper tantrum over money and a couple of rooms is honestly pathetic. Just pack your stuff and head down to the basement so we can finish eating our food in peace. I looked down at Malik and Nia. They were clutching my hands tightly, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. They were witnessing their mother being degraded, dismissed, and financially exploited by the people who were supposed to love us the most. I realized in that exact moment that staying in this house for even one more second would teach my children that this behavior was acceptable. It would teach my daughter that being a strong Black woman meant tolerating disrespect. It would teach my son that being a man meant taking advantage of the women around him. I squeezed their hands reassuringly. We are not going to the basement, I said, my voice eerily calm. We are not staying in this house tonight. Calvin drew himself up to his full height, his chest puffed out with arrogant authority. He pointed straight toward the heavy oak front door of the brownstone. If you will not respect the hierarchy of this family, Calvin bellowed, his voice echoing off the hallway walls, then get out. If you will not support your brother's legacy, get out of my house, now. Do not bother coming back down for breakfast. Take your kids and leave. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I did not look back at the steaming plates of soul food left on the table. I simply turned my back on my father, my mother, my brother, and his wife. I pulled open the heavy front door and walked out into the pouring Atlanta rain, keeping my children close to my side. The cold water hit my skin, instantly washing away the oppressive heat of the dining room. I heard the heavy door slam shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the wet night air. They had thrown us out into a storm with nowhere to sleep, entirely convinced they had won. They were absolutely certain they had broken me. They thought I was walking away empty-handed, a defeated single mother forced to start over from scratch. They envisioned me crying in my car, wondering how I was going to afford a new apartment while they enjoyed the spoils of my labor. But as I clicked the unlock button on my key fob and ushered my children into the warmth of my car, I felt no fear. I felt no panic. I only felt a dark, satisfying anticipation. They had just kicked the landlord out of her own property, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. I woke up before the sun even had a chance to crest over the Atlanta skyline. The luxury presidential suite was completely silent, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged both outside and inside my family's home the night before. I walked into the second bedroom to check on Malik and Nia. They were tangled in the high thread count sheets, sleeping peacefully. For the first time in a long time, the tension was gone from my son's jaw. I left a note on the nightstand and sent a quick text to the hotel concierge to arrange a private breakfast buffet for them when they woke up. I threw on my usual faded jeans and an oversized college sweatshirt, grabbing my keys. It was time to execute a surgical extraction. I just needed to grab my children's essential clothes, their school uniforms, and Malik's expensive gaming laptop before my family could hold those items hostage. The morning light was harsh as I pulled my Honda SUV up to the curb of the historic brownstone. The rain had washed the streets clean, but looking at the red brick facade of the house I had paid to save from the auction block, all I saw was a decaying monument to my father's fragile ego. I walked up the stone steps, sliding my key into the heavy oak front door. I pushed it open quietly, expecting to find the house asleep. I figured Darius and Tasha would be sleeping and exhausted from their own manufactured drama. Instead, the loud abrasive rustle of heavy-duty plastic echoed from the hallway. I stepped into the foyer and felt my blood run ice cold. Tasha was standing in the middle of the hallway wearing a silk designer robe, holding a massive black contractor garbage bag. Surrounding her were the contents of my children's bedrooms. She reached down and scooped up a handful of Nia's beloved stuffed animals, carelessly shoving them into the trash bag like they were contaminated waste. Next to her foot was Malik's prized possession, a massive, intricate Lego architecture set that took him 3 months of dedicated focus to build. With a casual, deliberate kick of her slippered foot, Tasha shattered a corner of the Lego building. She grabbed a dustpan and began sweeping the broken pieces, the remnants of my son's hard work, directly into the garbage. "What do you think you are doing?" I demanded, my voice cutting through the quiet house like a whip. Tasha did not even flinch. She tossed another stuffed animal into the bag and let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh. "I am cleansing the space, Maya," she said, waving her manicured hand around the hallway. "This house is about to welcome the new heir. I need positive, wealthy energy in here. Your kids left all this cheap junk everywhere, and it is completely cluttering the vibe. I am doing you a massive favor by throwing it out, so you do not have to drag it to whatever tiny rundown apartment you end up renting. You should be thanking me." I lunged forward, snatching the heavy black bag right out of her hands. Before I could even issue a warning to back away from my children's belongings, a voice drifted from the kitchen. "Do not you dare raise your voice at a pregnant woman, Maya." I snapped my head around. My mother, Brenda, was leaning comfortably against the granite countertop. She was calmly sipping her morning coffee from a mug bearing the logo of her church women's ministry. She had been standing there the entire time. She watched her daughter-in-law destroy her own grandchildren's cherished belongings and did absolutely nothing to stop it. In fact, she looked entirely at peace with the destruction. "Mom," I said, pointing a shaking finger at the shattered Lego set on the floor. "She is literally throwing Malik's hard work into the garbage. Naya sleeps with that bear every single night. You are just going to stand there in your Sunday best and watch her throw your grandchildren's lives into the trash." Brenda took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. She looked at the plastic mess on the floor and then looked back at me with an expression of pure, dismissive boredom. "It is just plastic and cheap stuffing," Maya, my mother said, smoothly adjusting her silk robe. "You can buy them new toys. You always have money hidden somewhere. Darius and Tasha need a clean slate to build their nursery, and this clutter is not helping their mental state. You know how stressful pregnancy can be on a young mother. You need to be more accommodating and stop acting so hostile in your father's house. The Lord commands us to keep peace in the home, and you are bringing a very dark, bitter energy into this blessing." The sheer psychological warfare of her statement was breathtaking. She was actively weaponizing Tasha's pregnancy to justify the malicious destruction of my children's property. She was gaslighting me, minimizing the emotional violence being inflicted on Malik and Nia, and once again defaulting to the narrative that because I was a strong Black woman, I could simply absorb the financial and emotional damage, buy my way out of it, and keep my mouth shut. I was expected to finance their luxury and absorb their abuse, all while being painted as the villain for daring to object. I did not waste another breath trying to appeal to a maternal instinct she clearly did not possess. Arguing with a woman who used scripture to justify cruelty was a losing battle. I stepped around the debris, completely ignoring Tasha's theatrical eye rolls, and began rapidly gathering the essential items that had not yet been destroyed. I spotted Malik's heavy laptop bag sitting on the hallway console table and immediately slung it over my shoulder. I grabbed a canvas duffel bag from the coat closet and started shoving their school uniforms, winter coats, and remaining shoes inside. Every movement I made was calculated and precise. "You are making a huge mess," Tasha complained, crossing her arms over her chest. "Calvin said you had to be out by this morning. You are trespassing on our property right now. I could call the police and have you removed for harassing a pregnant woman." I zipped the duffel bag shut with a sharp, violent tug. I turned to face Tasha, letting the cold, dead calm that had settled over me last night rise to the surface. "If you ever touch my children's belongings again," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that made Tasha take a physical step backward, "I will make sure you never own a single thing of value for the rest of your miserable life." Before Tasha could formulate a response, heavy, arrogant footsteps echoed on the hardwood stairs above us. I looked up. Darius was descending the staircase, practically bouncing with unearned confidence. He was dressed in a crisp, expensive button-down shirt, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He carried himself like a man who had just conquered the world, despite having never worked a hard day in his entire life. In his right hand, he held a thick, crisp manila envelope. He stopped on the bottom step, looking down at me, as I stood amidst the scattered toys and the half-filled garbage bags. A wide, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He tapped the thick envelope against his palm, the sound echoing in the tense hallway. His eyes gleamed with a greedy, predatory anticipation. "Actually, Mom," Darius said, his voice dripping with condescension as he looked directly at me, "she will not have hidden money for long. Dad and I just got off the phone with the lawyer." Darius stepped off the final stair, walking right through the scattered pieces of my son's broken toys, as if they were nothing but gravel beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. He held up a thick manila envelope, waving it back and forth like a trophy he had actually earned. The thick, heavy stock paper made a crisp, authoritative sound. It was exactly the kind of performance someone who had watched too many legal dramas on television would put on. Tasha immediately perked up, her posture shifting from defensive to triumphant. Even my mother lowered her coffee mug, a satisfied, knowing gleam appearing in her eyes. I adjusted the strap of Malik's laptop bag on my shoulder, keeping my face entirely impassive. "What lawyer, Darius?" I asked, my voice flat. "You do not even have a lawyer. You use free legal advice forums on the internet when your crypto schemes go bankrupt." Darius chuckled, a deeply grating sound of pure arrogance. "Not my lawyer, Maya. Dad's lawyer. The family lawyer." He pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from the envelope, holding them out so I could see the dense legal text printed on the front page. "Dad decided it is time to protect the family legacy from people who do not understand loyalty. He is officially transferring the deed of this entire brownstone solely into my name." He paused, waiting for me to gasp or cry. When I did not, he continued, his tone dripping with unearned superiority. "Like Dad said last night, I am the man of my house now. I have a son on the way. I need assets to build generational wealth. Since you decided to be hostile and demand your little $100,000 back, Dad realized you are a financial liability to the family structure. We are securing the property so you cannot try to claim it in some bitter lawsuit later." The sheer delusion of his statement was almost magnificent. Generational wealth. He was standing in a house I saved, wearing a watch our mother bought him, talking about building wealth by literally having his father hand him a multi-million-dollar property for free. "You are transferring a house you cannot afford to maintain," I stated simply. "You do not even pay your own phone bill, Darius. How are you going to pay the property taxes?" "That brings me to the second part of our legal arrangement," Darius said, his smirk widening into something genuinely sinister. He pulled a second document from the envelope and shoved it toward my chest. I did not raise my hands to take it. The paper fluttered to the floor, landing right next to the garbage bag holding my daughter's stuffed animals. Darius glared at the floor for a second before looking back at me. "That is a legal waiver, Maya. Dad and I had the lawyer drafted up this morning. We know you want your $100,000 back. And honestly, we are willing to give it to you, eventually. But if you ever want to see a single dime of that money again, You are going to sign that paper. I looked down at the document on the floor, then back up at his face. What exactly does that paper say, Darius? It is a relinquishment of claims, he said proudly, clearly repeating the exact phrasing the lawyer had fed him over the phone. By signing it, you legally forfeit any future claim to this estate. You also sign away your percentage of mom and dad's life insurance policies. Everything goes directly to me to secure the future of the family name. Tasha stepped forward, crossing her arms and chiming in with her own brand of toxic entitlement. The diamond ring on her finger caught the morning light, a ring I knew Darius had financed with a predatory loan. And you agree to set up an irrevocable educational trust for our son, Tasha demanded. You are going to pay for his private school tuition from kindergarten through high school. It is your duty as an Aunt Maya. You have the money. We have the heir. It is only fair that you contribute to his success since you are out here living a selfish single lifestyle. I stared at her in absolute disbelief. They were holding my own money hostage, using it to blackmail me into giving up my entire future inheritance, and extorting me into paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in private school tuition for a child that had not even taken his first breath. The level of financial extortion was so staggering, so meticulously cruel, that it belonged in a textbook on narcissistic abuse. Before I could even process the magnitude of their audacity, heavy footsteps echoed from the back hallway. My father Calvin strode into the foyer. He was dressed in his sharpest Sunday suit, carrying his leather-bound Bible under his arm. He carried himself with the heavy, unearned dignity of a man who believed God himself endorsed his tyranny. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Darius, presenting a united, impenetrable front of male authority. You heard your brother, Maya, Calvin said, his deep voice booming with absolute finality. I am tired of your disrespect. I am tired of you throwing your financial independence in our faces. You walk around here with a chip on your shoulder because your own marriage failed. You are a bitter, divorced woman who is just jealous that Darius has a whole family. He has a wife who respects him. He has a son on the way. He is doing things the right way, the biblical way. You are just angry because you are ending up alone. He pointed a stern, punishing finger at the waiver lying on the floor. I am giving you exactly 24 hours to sign those papers and return them to my lawyer, Calvin ordered. If you sign them, you agree to support your nephew's education and you walk away from my estate. In exchange, I will figure out a payment plan to slowly return your $100,000 over the next 10 years. And if I do not sign it, I asked, my voice completely devoid of any tremor or hesitation. Calvin smiled, a cold, ruthless expression that chilled the air in the hallway. If you do not sign it by tomorrow morning, then my lawyer will file official documents declaring that your $100,000 was a voluntary gift to the family. You have no contract stating it was a loan. You have no legally binding promissory note. It was a verbal exchange between family members. The court will see it as a daughter gifting money to her father to help with household expenses. You will get absolutely nothing. And you will never step foot on my property again. Silence descended on the foyer. Brenda took another slow sip of her coffee, looking perfectly content with the fact that her husband and son were actively extorting her daughter. Tasha ran a hand over her belly, looking at me with pure, undisguised pity. Darius stood tall, his chest puffed out, waiting for me to break down, cry, and beg for my money back. They had built what they believed was a flawless, inescapable trap. They had used my love, my loyalty, and my financial resources against me, and they were entirely convinced they held all the power. I was a cybersecurity expert. My entire professional life was dedicated to analyzing threat landscapes, identifying vulnerabilities, and neutralizing hostile actors. I looked at the four people standing in the foyer, not as my family, but as a hostile breach. And they had just made a fatal miscalculation. As I stood there looking at the four people who shared my blood, the very last shred of familial obligation inside my heart quietly snapped. It did not break with a loud, dramatic explosion. It snapped with the quiet, permanent severing of a dead tie. Instead of crying, instead of screaming, a cold, dead calm washed over my entire body. It was the absolute clarity of a predator realizing the prey had just willingly locked itself inside the cage. I looked down at the legal waiver resting on the hardwood floor. I looked at the broken pieces of my son's toys scattered around it. I looked at my mother's passive-aggressive stance, Tasha's greedy smirk, and Darius's unearned arrogance. Finally, I looked directly into my father's smug, authoritative face. I did not pick up the paper. I did not raise my voice. I simply adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "You should really read the fine print on your property taxes, Dad," I said softly. Calvin's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowing in sudden, unexpected confusion. Darius blinked, looking down at the envelope in his hand as if it had suddenly caught fire. I did not elaborate. I did not give them a single piece of additional information. I simply turned around, pushed open the heavy oak front door, and walked out of the brownstone into the crisp morning air. I walked down the stone steps and got into my car in total silence, leaving them trapped in the echo of my final words. The drive from the brownstone to the downtown financial district took exactly 22 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I did not make any phone calls. I simply let the rhythmic hum of the tires on the wet asphalt carry me forward while my mind shifted entirely from the role of a discarded daughter to the role of a corporate CEO. The emotional bleeding had completely stopped. My family had played their final hand thinking they had trapped me in a corner of obligation and guilt. They had no idea they were playing checkers on a board where I controlled every single square. I pulled my Honda into the secure underground parking garage of one of the most exclusive commercial skyscrapers in Atlanta. A private keycard restricted elevator shot me up to the 45th floor. The glass doors slid open to reveal the immaculate minimalist reception area of Davis & Associates. I walked straight past the front desk. The receptionist gave me a familiar, respectful nod, knowing I never needed an appointment. I pushed open the heavy mahogany door at the end of the hall and stepped into the sleek, high-rise office of my attorney. Ms. Davis was a force of nature. She was a sharp, no-nonsense African-American lawyer who commanded respect the second she entered a courtroom. She wore a flawless emerald green silk suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She had handled every major contract merger and acquisition for my cybersecurity firm since the day I incorporated it. She knew the exact scope of my wealth, and she knew exactly how toxic my biological family was. She looked up from her dual monitors as I walked in, immediately sensing the shift in my demeanor. She closed her laptop, folded her hands on her massive glass desk, and waited. I sat down in the leather chair opposite her and slid a sleek black USB drive across the pristine glass surface. "I need you to pull up the Onyx Holdings real estate portfolio," I said, my voice crisp and authoritative. "Specifically, the residential acquisition we executed 6 months ago in the historic district." Ms. Davis raised an eyebrow, picking up the drive. She plugged it into her secure terminal and began typing with rapid, practiced movements. "The brownstone," she confirmed, her eyes scanning the digital files that appeared on her screen. "The property currently occupied by your parents. What is the situation, Maya?" "They just tried to evict me," I stated simply. Ms. Davis stopped typing. She looked at me, her sharp eyes narrowing in utter disbelief. She knew the entire history of that house. She knew exactly what I had done to secure it. I leaned back in the leather chair, letting the memory of what happened exactly 6 months ago wash over me. The grand reveal of my family's ultimate vulnerability was a secret I had kept locked away, waiting for the exact moment they tried to betray me. 6 months ago, the facade of my father's perfect, righteous life had completely fractured. Calvin had always projected the image of a wealthy, successful church elder. He demanded respect and financial submission from everyone around him. But behind closed doors, his financial reality was a catastrophic mess of his own making. He had taken out multiple secret, high-interest loans against the equity of the brownstone to fund his extravagant lifestyle, to buy bespoke suits, and to make massive, flashy donations to his church so the congregation would applaud his generosity. He had prioritized his ego over his basic obligations. He stopped paying the property taxes. He ignored the warning letters. He hid the notices from my mother. The bank eventually came to collect, A final notice of foreclosure was posted scheduling the historic family brownstone for public auction. Calvin had panicked. The thought of losing his home, of being exposed as a financial fraud to his beloved church community, absolutely terrified him. He had called me in the middle of the night, weeping on the phone, begging me to save him. He used the exact same manipulation tactics my mother had used this morning. He told me I was a strong black woman, that I had been blessed with a good career, and that it was my holy duty to save the family legacy. He demanded $100,000 to pay off the immediate tax debt and stop the auction. But I did not just hand him a check. I am a cybersecurity expert. My entire career is built on identifying vulnerabilities, assessing risk, and establishing absolute control over unsecured networks. Handing $100,000 in cash to a man drowning in predatory loans was the equivalent of pouring water into a shattered glass. I knew that if I gave him the money directly, he would simply leverage the house again the very next month to fund Darius's next failed business venture. I refused to let my hard-earned wealth be flushed down the drain of his arrogance. So I orchestrated a silent, flawless corporate takeover. I utilized my private investment firm, Onyx Holdings, LLC. My name was nowhere on the public-facing documents of the corporation. It was completely shielded by a blind trust and a series of ironclad non-disclosure agreements managed by Ms. Davis. Instead of paying the back taxes on my father's behalf, Onyx Holdings approached the bank directly. My firm purchased the distressed debt in its entirety. We bought the note and we legally acquired the deed to the property right out from under the foreclosure proceedings. To prevent my father from realizing his own daughter had just become his landlord, Ms. Davis and her corporate agents executed a brilliant psychological maneuver. They contacted Calvin and informed him that a private entity called the Black Community Restoration Fund had stepped in to purchase the property. The agent stroked his massive ego, telling him that the fund recognized his vital, prestigious status as a pillar of the local church community and wanted to ensure historic properties remained in the hands of respected community leaders. Calvin swallowed the lie without a single second of hesitation. His narcissism was so profound that he genuinely believed a corporate entity had swooped in to save him simply because he was so important. He bragged about it for weeks. He told the entire church congregation that God had sent a corporate angel to protect his legacy. He assumed that the $100,000 cashier's check I handed him a week later was strictly to repair the collapsing roof, replace the rusted plumbing, and install a new HVAC system. He gladly took my money to upgrade the house entirely, unaware that he was simply renovating a property that belonged 100% to Onyx Holdings, LLC, which meant it belonged 100% to me. For 6 months, Calvin, Brenda, and Darius had been living in my house. They were legally nothing more than tenants occupying the space on a $0 lease agreement, completely at the mercy of my corporate goodwill. I sat in Ms. Davis's office and brought her up to speed on the events of the morning. I detailed how Tasha had thrown my children's toys into garbage bags. I explained how my mother had weaponized my strength to demand my submission. And finally, I described the absolute comedy of Darius standing on the staircase with his fake legal documents, threatening to steal my money while attempting to transfer a deed he did not even own. Darius claims that Dad's lawyer is drafting paperwork to transfer the deed of the brownstone into Darius's name today. I explained, keeping my tone perfectly analytical. They are attempting to secure the house to build a nursery, and they gave me 24 hours to sign a waiver forfeiting my $100,000, or they will claim it was a voluntary gift. Ms. Davis stopped looking at the computer monitor and slowly turned her gaze toward me. A heavy, profound silence filled the luxurious office. She reached up and deliberately took off her designer reading glasses, placing them gently onto the glass desk. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a legal shark who had just watched a group of amateurs jump directly into a pool of blood. "So Ms. Davis," said, her voice dripping with lethal professional amusement, "your father is attempting to legally transfer a deed he does not possess. He is trying to gift a multi-million-dollar historic property to a son who is currently living rent-free in a house owned entirely by you." And they are attempting to extort you out of $100,000 by threatening to kick you out of your own real estate asset. That is the exact summary of the situation, I replied, matching her predatory smile. Ms. Davis let out a sharp, elegant laugh that echoed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She picked up a silver pen and tapped it rhythmically against her notepad. The sheer audacity is almost poetic, Ms. Davis mused, shaking her head. If Calvin attempts to file any transfer of deed with the county clerk, using his name he will be committing felony real estate fraud. But we do not even need to wait for him to implicate himself in a criminal act. The $0 lease agreement between Onyx Holdings and Calvin states that the tenancy can be terminated immediately for any hostile action against the property owner or simply at the owner's discretion with standard notice. She leaned forward, her eyes locked onto mine, ready to execute the corporate strike we had prepared for. "Shall we initiate the eviction?" Ms. Davis asked. "Drafted," I reply. 3 days later, the storm had entirely passed, leaving behind a crisp, sunlit Atlanta morning. I sat at the massive quartz kitchen island of my new luxury high-rise condo, wrapping my hands around a warm ceramic mug, holding a perfectly frothed vanilla latte. The condo was a sprawling 3,000-square-foot penthouse located right in the heart of downtown. It had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the city skyline. The space was immaculate, secure, and most importantly, it was entirely mine. Malik and Nia were sitting in the spacious living room happily eating pancakes while watching a movie on the massive flat-screen television. They had their own massive bedrooms with ensuite bathrooms. There was no exposed fiberglass, no damp concrete, and absolutely no toxic family members lurking in the hallways to make them feel small. They were safe. I had used a tiny fraction of my corporate dividends to lease the penthouse for the next year, paying the entire lease up front in cash. It was a seamless transition executed with the precision my cybersecurity firm was known for. I took a slow, savoring sip of my latte, enjoying the absolute pristine silence of my own sanctuary. Then the silence shattered. My phone, resting face down on the quartz counter, began to vibrate violently. It buzzed against the smooth stone, spinning in frantic little circles. I did not immediately reach for it. I just sat there watching the device dance across the counter, knowing exactly what was happening miles away in the historic district. Ms. Davis operates with surgical punctuality. I knew the exact schedule of her process servers. I finally reached out and flipped the phone over. The screen lit up, flooded with a tidal wave of desperate, frantic notifications. 47 missed calls from Calvin, 22 missed calls from Brenda, 15 missed calls from Darius. The numbers kept ticking upward as I watched. A new call from my father lit up the screen, his contact photo flashing brightly. I let it ring. I watched the call drop, only for a new one from my mother to immediately take its place. The sheer, unadulterated panic radiating through the digital network was palpable. The untouchable, arrogant patriarch who had confidently thrown me and his grandchildren out into the rain just 72 hours ago was now desperately hammering my phone line like a drowning man grasping for a life preserver. I swiped past the missed calls and opened my voicemail inbox. There were over a dozen new audio messages. I tapped the first one from my father, turned the volume all the way up, and placed the phone on speaker in the center of the kitchen island. "Maya, pick up the phone." Calvin's voice boomed through the speaker, but the authoritative, booming resonance of the church elder was completely gone. His voice was shaking, high-pitched and breathless with absolute terror. "You need to call me back the exact second you hear this message. There is an emergency at the house. A major legal emergency." I could hear the frantic rustling of paper in the background of the recording. A man in a suit just walked right up to the front steps and taped a notice to the front door. Calvin continued, his breathing heavy and ragged. "A bright yellow legal notice of eviction. They are giving us 30 days to vacate the premises, Maya." 30 days. The landlord listed on the paperwork is Onyx Holdings, LLC. I do not understand what is happening. The Black Community Restoration Fund was supposed to be protecting this house. I thought they bought the deed to secure the legacy for our family. But these people, this Onyx Holdings, they are corporate vultures. They are trying to steal our legacy right out from under us. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it in my coffee. He was cursing the very corporate entity that had saved him from total public ruin 6 months prior, entirely unaware that the ruthless corporate vulture he was screaming about was currently sitting in a penthouse, drinking a latte, and listening to his meltdown. Maya listened to me carefully, Calvin's voicemail pressed on the desperation morphing into demanding entitlement. You need to go to your bank immediately. You need to wire $50,000 into my checking account by the end of business today. I need to hire a heavyweight defense attorney. I need a ruthless litigator to drag these Onyx people into court and tie them up in injunctions. We are going to fight these vultures and protect your brother's inheritance. I know you have the money, Maya. Do not play games right now. The family needs you. Call me back immediately. The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. He had just kicked my children out into a storm to secure a luxury nursery for his favorite son, and his immediate reaction to a crisis was to demand $50,000 from the very daughter he had just discarded. He still viewed me as nothing more than a highly functioning ATM machine, completely devoid of human feelings or boundaries. I tapped the next voicemail on the screen. This one was from Brenda, but she was not the only one speaking. Maya, please pick up the phone. My mother's voice trembled through the speaker, heavily laced with the weaponized guilt she had spent decades perfecting. Your father is having chest pains. Darius is pacing a hole in the floor. The devil is truly attacking this family today, Maya, and we need you to step up and be the strong black woman God called you to be. You need to bring your checkbook and come home right now. Suddenly, the sound of loud theatrical sobbing hijacked the background of the audio. Tasha had clearly snatched the phone from my mother's hand. Maya, how can you just ignore us? Tasha wailed into the receiver, her voice artificially heightened to maximize the dramatic effect. I am pregnant. I am carrying the first male grandson of this family. Do you have any idea what this stress is doing to my body? Seeing a bright yellow eviction notice taped to my front door is inducing early contractions. The doctor said I need positive energy, Maya. If I lose this house, the stress is going to be terrible for the baby. You have to fix this. You cannot just let a greedy corporation put a pregnant woman on the street. Darius said you always have money hidden away. Send the $50,000 today so Dad can hire the lawyer. Please, Maya, do it for your nephew. The message beeped and ended. I sat perfectly still, letting the absolute absurdity of their demands settle over me. 3 days ago, Tasha had literally kicked my son's expensive Lego sets across the hardwood floor and shoved my daughter's beloved stuffed animals into black contractor garbage bags. She had looked me dead in the eye and told me my children's belongings were cluttering the wealthy vibe of her future nursery. She had mocked my divorce, belittled my status as a single mother, and cheered as my father pointed to the door. Now faced with the terrifying prospect of actually having to pay for her own lifestyle, she was weaponizing her unborn child to extort $50,000 from me. They still believed I was their financial mule. They still believed they could abuse me, discard me, and then simply snap their fingers and demand I empty my bank accounts to shield them from the consequences of their own spectacular failures. They truly believed that Onyx Holdings was a faceless, greedy conglomerate trying to steal their historic brownstone, and that I was just the foolish, loyal daughter who would blindly finance their legal defense against my own corporation. I picked up my smartphone. I opened the messaging app and navigated to the family group chat, the same group chat where just 3 days prior, Darius had posted a picture of him and Tasha toasting with champagne glasses in the dining room, captioning it with a joke about how quiet the house was without my kids running around. I tapped the text box. I did not write a long emotional paragraph. I did not explain my feelings. I did not defend my decision, and I certainly did not reveal my identity as the CEO of Onyx Holdings. The trap was not fully sprung yet. I needed them to walk directly into the courtroom before I dropped the final guillotine blade. I typed my response slowly, deliberately, choosing the exact words they had used to humiliate me. I made sure every single syllable was a precise, calculated reflection of their own malicious arrogance. I hit send. The message popped up in a bright blue bubble on the screen, delivering my response to Calvin, Brenda, Darius, and Tasha simultaneously. I can't help you, I wrote. I'm just a divorced single mom, remember? You should ask Darius to use his crypto money to save the house. I set the phone back down on the quartz counter and watched the screen. Instantly, three little gray typing bubbles appeared at the bottom of the chat. Calvin, Brenda, and Darius were all frantically typing replies at the exact same moment. The bubbles danced on the screen, indicating a massive coordinated wave of furious responses was about to flood my phone. They were probably typing out demand scripture quotes, threats of disownment, and furious insults. I took another calm, measured sip of my vanilla latte. Suddenly, Calvin's typing bubble vanished. A second later, Brenda's typing bubble disappeared. Finally, Darius's typing bubble blinked out of existence. The family group chat went completely, utterly, and terrifyingly dead silent. They had finally realized that the bank was closed. The mule had broken her harness. The strong black woman they had relied on to absorb their failures and fund their delusions had just firmly and permanently cut the financial cord. For the very first time in their arrogant, entitled lives, they were staring down the barrel of total ruin, and there was absolutely no one coming to save them. I locked my phone screen, stood up from the kitchen island, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the sprawling, sunlit city of Atlanta. A deep, profoundly satisfying warmth spread through my chest. The panic had officially begun, and the public execution was only just getting started. It only took 48 hours for my family to realize that their private intimidation tactics were completely useless. When the aggressive text messages and frantic voicemails failed to extract a single dollar from my bank account, they immediately pivoted to their favorite weapon: public humiliation. By Friday evening, my phone began vibrating with a steady stream of notifications. Links, screenshots, and alarmed messages from extended cousins, old high school classmates, and various busybodies from my parents' social circle flooded my inbox. Tasha had gone live on Facebook and Instagram. I opened the link sent by my cousin. Tasha was sitting on the front steps of the historic brownstone. She had deliberately stripped off her usual Gucci belts and Prada sunglasses. Instead, she was wearing an oversized, faded maternity sweater, clutching her stomach and looking directly into the camera with wide, tear-filled eyes. It was a masterclass in performative victimhood. In the video, Tasha wept openly. She started by demonizing Onyx Holdings LLC, painting my private investment firm as a faceless, greedy corporate monster, swooping into historic black neighborhoods to gentrify the area and throw pregnant women out onto the street. She cried about the 30-day eviction notice taped to the door, but she did not stop there. The corporate vulture narrative was not generating enough sympathy, so she introduced a villain with a face: me. Tasha looked into her smartphone camera and told hundreds of viewers that her wealthy, bitter sister-in-law was standing by and watching them lose everything. She spun a fabricated, highly edited tale of absolute betrayal. According to Tasha, I was a miserable, divorced woman who was so violently jealous of her perfect marriage and her pregnancy that I was intentionally hoarding my wealth out of pure spite. She cried that my father, a respected church elder, had humbly asked me for a $50,000 loan to hire a lawyer and save the family legacy, and I had cruelly laughed in his face. Darius was hovering in the background of the video, looking down at the concrete steps, playing the role of the stoic, victimized patriarch who was just trying to protect his growing family from a ruthless corporate system and a heartless sister. He occasionally reached out to pat Tasha's shoulder, looking utterly defeated. Within hours, my father shared the video on his own social media pages. He captioned it with carefully selected Bible verses about greed, the love of money being the root of all evil, and the spiritual danger of turning one's back on blood relatives. The comments section became a toxic echo chamber. People I had not spoken to in a decade were leaving comments calling me a disgrace to the community, an ungrateful daughter, and a bitter woman who needed to find God. They were trying to build a digital mob. They wanted the sheer weight of public shame to crush my boundaries. They expected me to panic, to call them begging for the video to be taken down, and to wire the money just to buy back my reputation. I did not report the video. I did not leave a comment defending myself. I simply downloaded the entire broadcast, saved it to my encrypted server, and forwarded a copy to Ms. Davis. Every single defamatory word Tasha spoke was just another nail I would gladly hammer into their financial coffin. When Sunday morning arrived, Calvin escalated his smear campaign from the digital world to the physical one. I no longer attended my parents' church, having grown exhausted by the rampant hypocrisy and endless gossip years ago, but I still had a few genuine friends in the congregation who kept me informed. According to my sources, Calvin took the pulpit right before the main sermon. As a senior church elder, he commanded absolute respect from the hundreds of parishioners packed into the pews. He requested a special prayer for his family. He stood before the altar, bowed his head, and asked the congregation to pray for a daughter whose heart had been entirely hardened by the secular world and the deceptive allure of wealth. He played the ultimate suffering martyr. He told the church that his family was under heavy spiritual and financial attack by a ruthless corporation trying to steal their historic home. He painted a picture of a desperate father fighting to protect his unborn grandson. Then, with a perfectly timed break in his voice, he announced that his own flesh and blood, a daughter he had raised and provided for, had turned her back on them in their hour of greatest need. He asked the church to pray that God would soften my heart, that I would repent for my selfishness, and that I would remember my biblical duty to honor my father and mother. The congregation ate it up. They murmured in sympathy. They offered him an outpouring of prayers, validation, and emotional support. Calvin had successfully transformed his impending legal eviction into a spiritual warfare narrative where he was the righteous victim and I was the agent of the enemy. The Sunday service was just the setup. The true attack came later that afternoon. I was sitting in my penthouse living room helping Malik with a science project when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of Reverend Williams, the senior pastor of my parents' church. He was a man who had known me since I was a little girl in Sunday school. He was also a man who considered Calvin to be one of his most loyal and generous financial contributors, totally unaware that Calvin's generous tithes were funded by predatory home equity loans. I picked up the phone and accepted the call. I knew exactly what was coming. Maya, my child. The pastor began, his voice dropping into that deep, soothing, heavily practiced tone of pastoral counseling. I am calling you today out of a deep spiritual concern for your soul. Your father came to me after service today. He is a broken man, Maya. He is carrying a burden that is too heavy for his shoulders, and it grieves my spirit to hear that you are refusing to help him lift it. I did not say a word. I just sat at the kitchen island, staring out at the city, letting the silence encourage him to keep going. The pastor took my silence as submission and launched into a highly calculated, spiritually manipulative lecture. He spent the next few minutes weaponizing scripture to break down my boundaries. He reminded me of the biblical commandment to honor thy father and mother, stating that this commandment did not come with conditions. He told me that family was a sacred covenant and that abandoning my brother, while he was preparing to bring a new life into the world, was a direct violation of God's design for the family structure. Maya, the Lord has clearly blessed you with financial abundance. The pastor preached, his voice rising slightly in rhythmic cadence. He gave you a successful business and a sharp mind. But those blessings are not meant to be hoarded out of bitterness. They are meant to be shared. They are meant to be a blessing to your family. Your father is facing the loss of his home to a greedy corporation. He is simply asking for a $50,000 loan to secure legal representation and fight for your family's legacy. He paused, letting the guilt trip marinate. Holding on to anger over a minor disagreement about bedrooms is petty, Maya. It is a trick of the enemy to divide a strong black family. I am urging you, as your spiritual shepherd, to let go of this pride. Wire the funds to your father. Use the wealth God gave you to protect your brother's future. It would be an act of profound spiritual redemption, and it would restore the peace in your father's house. I looked at the clock on my phone screen. I had let him talk for exactly 5 uninterrupted minutes. 5 minutes of pure, concentrated religious manipulation designed to shame me into emptying my bank account to fund my father's delusions. He had utilized every single buzzword in the book. He had played the legacy card, the family unity card, and the divine duty card. The pastor finally paused to take a breath, waiting for my inevitable tearful capitulation. He expected me to break down, apologize for my hardened heart, and promise to send the money immediately. I took a slow, deep breath. I kept my voice completely flat, drained of any emotion, any guilt, and any hesitation. Pastor, I interrupted calmly, my words cutting through the heavy, expectant silence on the line like a scalpel. Does the Bible say anything about a father who watches his son try to secretly mortgage the family home to a predatory loan shark? The dead, absolute silence that fell over the phone line was deafening. The pastor's righteous momentum hit a brick wall. I could hear him open his mouth, close it, and swallow hard. "Excuse me." The pastor stammered, his polished counseling voice completely fracturing. "What did you just say?" I hang up. How did I know about the predatory loans? I'm a cybersecurity expert. My entire professional existence revolves around tracing hidden digital footprints, penetrating obscured networks, and following the money when hostile actors try to cover their tracks. When Darius had smugly bragged about his cryptocurrency investments at Sunday dinners, I knew he was blowing smoke. He used basic, unsecured wireless networks to conduct his so-called business. He used the same simple password for every single account since high school. Penetrating his digital life did not even require a fraction of my actual skill set. It was like picking a lock made of wet paper. I had monitored his network traffic for months, purely as a precaution to ensure his reckless behavior did not somehow compromise my own financial security. What I found buried in his encrypted message folders and hidden email accounts was a financial horror story of epic proportions. Darius was not just a lazy, unemployed man living off his mother. He was actively drowning in an ocean of highly dangerous, unregulatable debt. He had bought into the illusion of becoming a crypto billionaire. But instead of using his own money because he never had any, he had turned to offshore, unregulated cryptocurrency lenders. These were not traditional banks. These were digital loan sharks operating entirely outside the boundaries of international financial law. He had leveraged phantom assets, lied on digital applications, and borrowed heavily on margin. When the crypto market inevitably crashed, his portfolio was completely and violently liquidated. He was left holding a massive, terrifying deficit. Darius owed exactly $250,000 to people who do not send polite collection letters in the mail. They sent threatening messages demanding immediate liquidation of assets. He was desperate, and a desperate, entitled golden child is the most dangerous creature on earth. I intercepted a series of draft emails and digital applications on his laptop. They laid out his grand, treacherous master plan with absolute clarity. He needed the historic brownstone transferred into his name, not to build a luxury nursery, and certainly not to secure the family legacy. He needed the deed so he could immediately approach hard money lenders. These predatory lenders do not care about credit scores or employment history. They only care about equity. Since I had just paid off the bank and cleared the tax debt with my own money, the brownstone was sitting there completely unencumbered, bursting with massive untapped equity. Darius planned to execute a cash-out refinance the exact second the deed cleared into his name. He was going to pull out a massive predatory loan against the equity of the house, take the cash, and immediately wire it offshore to pay off his dangerous crypto debts. The staggering interest rates of the new loan would make the monthly payments physically impossible for him to afford, and he knew that. He never had any intention of making a single payment. His plan was to secure the cash, save his own skin, and simply let the house slide right back into foreclosure. He was perfectly content to let the bank take the property effectively, leaving our parents homeless on the street, as long as he could walk away scot-free with his designer clothes and his pregnant wife. Sitting in my penthouse looking at the downloaded digital files of his loan applications, a profound, sickening realization washed over me. I looked at the digital signatures he had already practiced. I read the emails where he assured the hard money lenders that the deed transfer was just days away. The sheer scale of the betrayal was breathtaking. But what truly disgusted me was the absolute blinding sickness of the family system that had enabled it. Calvin was willing to throw me and his own grandchildren out into the freezing rain. He was willing to strip me of $100,000, demand my submission, and humiliate me in front of the entire church congregation. He did all of this simply to protect and enable a son who was actively plotting to destroy them all. Calvin's blind loyalty to the patriarchal hierarchy, his obsessive need to elevate the male heir above the dedicated daughter, was literally building a bomb underneath his own foundation. My mother, Brenda, had weaponized her faith and used my status as a strong black woman to force me into the basement, totally unaware that the golden child she babied and financed was ready to sell the roof over her head to save himself. They had chosen their pride over reality. They had chosen an illusion over actual security. They thought they were sacrificing me to protect the legacy, but they were actually handing the executioner the axe. Every single piece of the puzzle had perfectly snapped into place. Tasha's sudden urgency to throw my children's toys into the garbage was not about a nursery aesthetic. It was about clearing out the house to make the property look fully occupied and ready for an immediate bank appraisal. Calvin's furious demands for $50,000 to fight the eviction were ironically the only thing keeping him from giving the house to a son who would have stolen it anyway. I was not just evicting them, I was single-handedly stopping a massive familial financial crime, and they were fighting me tooth and nail to prevent their own rescue. I organized every single document into a highly secure encrypted digital folder. I printed out physical copies of the offshore loan demands. I printed the draft applications for the hard money equity loans. I placed them all into a sleek black leather portfolio. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel an ounce of the familial guilt they had tried so hard to instill in me since childhood. I only felt the cold, sharp edge of absolute justice. I was ready. The 30-day notice period flew by in a storm of community gossip, aggressive voicemails, and digital smear campaigns. My family continued to portray themselves as the tragic victims of a soulless corporate entity. They rallied the church, they cried on social media, and they prepared for battle, totally unaware that they were marching into a slaughterhouse. Finally, the morning of the eviction mediation arrived. This was the mandatory legal step before the police would physically remove them from the property. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my master bedroom, adjusting the cuffs of my pristine white dress shirt. I slid my arms into a tailored $3,000 Tom Ford suit. I clasped a heavy silver watch around my wrist. I was no longer the invisible, downtrodden daughter in the faded sweatshirt. I was the chief executive officer of Onyx Holdings, LLC. My phone buzzed on the vanity counter. I picked it up. It was a text message from Calvin. "We are going to court today. If you do not show up with a check to help us fight this, consider yourself dead to this family." I stared at the glowing screen. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of my mouth. I typed my response with deliberate rhythmic taps. "I will be there." I locked my phone screen and slid the device into my leather briefcase. The downtown traffic of Atlanta was notoriously heavy, but the back seat of the black town car I had hired for the morning was perfectly silent. I watched the Fulton County Courthouse loom into view through the tinted windows. The massive concrete structure stood as a monument to absolute, unyielding justice. It was the exact arena where my family thought they were going to put on a theatrical performance of victimhood. They believed they could bring their church pulpit tactics into a court of law and somehow walk away victorious against a faceless corporation. They had no idea the corporation had my face. My driver pulled up to the curb. I stepped out into the bright, sharp sunlight. I did not wear my faded jeans or my oversized college sweatshirts today. I was not playing the role of the humble, struggling single mother anymore. That character had officially been retired the second my father pointed toward the front door of the brownstone and ordered my children out into the rain. Today, I was dressed for a corporate execution. I walked through the heavy metal detectors and security checkpoints of the courthouse with Ms. Davis at my side. Her emerald green silk suit from yesterday had been replaced by a razor-sharp tailored charcoal pinstripe ensemble that screamed absolute legal dominance. She carried a thick leather portfolio containing every single piece of evidence required to completely dismantle the people waiting for us upstairs. We did not speak. We did not need to. The strategy had been locked in. We rode the elevator up to the third floor, moving toward the designated mediation rooms. The hallway was long lined with frosted glass windows and heavy oak doors. As we approached mediation room number 4, Ms. Davis placed a gentle hand on my arm and gestured for me to stop. We stood just out of sight, perfectly positioned to observe the waiting area through the narrow sliver of clear glass running along the side of the doorframe. I looked through the glass and took a slow, deep breath. My entire family was already inside the room, completely oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. They had turned the sterile municipal mediation room into their own personal staging ground for a tragic play. Calvin was sitting at the center of the defendant's side of the long wooden table. He was wearing his absolute best Sunday suit, a dark navy two-piece that he normally reserved for high holidays at the church. He had his heavy gold-embossed Bible placed prominently on the table right in front of him. His hand rested on top of it, his fingers drumming a steady, arrogant rhythm. He was practicing his posture, throwing his shoulders back, ready to put on a spectacular show for the mediator. He was entirely convinced that his status as a church elder would serve as a bulletproof shield against any legal eviction. Sitting directly to his right was my mother, Brenda. She had a tissue clutched in her hand, already dabbing at her dry eyes to practice the weeping mother routine. She was ready to tell the mediator how this cruel, greedy corporation was ripping a historic legacy away from a faithful, struggling Black family. She was playing her part perfectly, providing the emotional backing to my father's righteous indignation. But it was Darius and Tasha who truly completed the circus act. Darius was leaning back in his chair, exuding a desperate, hollow kind of bravado. He was wearing a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit that bunched awkwardly at his shoulders. He kept adjusting the collar, trying to look like a high-powered real estate investor who was simply being inconvenienced by a minor legal misunderstanding. He kept shooting arrogant, dismissive glances at the empty chairs across the table, acting tough and unbothered. He clearly thought that whoever showed up to represent Onyx Holdings would be some low-level corporate associate he could easily intimidate or manipulate. He had absolutely no idea that the offshore crypto lenders were closing in on him, and he believed this mediation was just a stepping stone to securing the deed and cashing out the equity. Beside him, Tasha was practically vibrating with visible annoyance. She sat with her arms crossed tightly over her pregnant belly, glaring at the clock on the wall. She had brought her most expensive designer handbag and placed it deliberately on the table right next to Calvin's Bible. The garish, flashy logo of the bag clashed violently with the serious legal atmosphere of the room. She kept sighing loudly, tapping her designer heels against the linoleum floor, acting as if her mere presence in a public courthouse was a massive insult to her wealthy aesthetic. She looked completely furious that she was being forced to defend the house she believed she was entitled to simply by marrying the golden child. To make the spectacle completely absurd, Calvin had actually brought character witnesses. Sitting in the chairs lined up against the back wall of the room was Reverend Williams, the senior pastor of their church. The pastor sat, with his hands folded, looking gravely concerned. Calvin had dragged him all the way down to the courthouse to provide spiritual intimidation. He wanted the mediator to see that he had the backing of a massive religious community. He wanted to use the pastor as a human shield, completely unaware that I had already destroyed the pastor's righteous momentum during our phone call just a few days prior. The sheer arrogance radiating from the room was intoxicating. They were all sitting there fully prepared to destroy a faceless corporation, perfectly confident in their lies and their stolen legacy. "We are ready," Ms. Davis whispered, checking her gold wristwatch. "The mediator has just entered through the judge's chambers in the back." I nodded. We waited exactly 2 more minutes, letting the tension inside the room build to an agonizing peak. Through the glass, I watched the mediator, a stern-looking older white man with graying hair and a thick stack of manila folders, take his seat at the head of the long wooden table. He adjusted his glasses, opened the first folder, and looked across the table at my family. He did not look impressed by Calvin's Bible. He did not look intimidated by the pastor sitting in the back row. He looked like a man who handled 10 evictions a day and wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible. "Good morning," the mediator said, his voice carrying through the heavy door. "We are here for the mediation and potential settlement of the eviction notice filed by Onyx Holdings, LLC, against the current occupants of the property located in the historic district. Calvin immediately leaned forward, placing both hands firmly on the table, ready to launch into his prepared speech. "Sir," my father began, his voice booming with unearned authority, "I am Calvin, the head of this household. We are here today to fight this unlawful, predatory action against my family's historic legacy. We have witnesses and we have the truth on our side." The mediator held up a single hand, cutting my father off instantly. "Mr. Calvin, you will have your turn to speak when I ask you to speak. This is a mediation, not a sermon. Please maintain decorum." Calvin's jaw snapped shut. His face flushed a dark shade of red at being corrected so swiftly. Darius shifted nervously in his cheap suit, realizing that his father's church tactics were not going to work in this room. Tasha let out an offended huff, grabbing her designer bag and pulling it onto her lap like a protective shield. The mediator looked down at his paperwork, checking the list of attendees. "Before we can begin the official proceedings and hear the defense," the mediator announced, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "I need to confirm the presence of the plaintiff. We cannot move forward without the legal representative of the property owner." He looked toward the empty chairs on the right side of the table, then looked toward the heavy oak double doors leading out to the hallway. "Is the authorized legal representative or the executive officer of Onyx Holdings, LLC present in the building?" the mediator called out loudly. This was the moment, the exact second the trap snapped shut. Ms. Davis reached out and firmly grasped the brass handle of the heavy oak door. She pushed it open with a smooth, forceful motion that made the heavy wood groan loudly on its hinges. The sound commanded the immediate attention of every single person inside the room. I stepped through the doorway. I was not wearing faded jeans. I was not wearing an oversized sweatshirt. I was wearing a tailored $3,000 Tom Ford suit in a deep midnight navy blue. The fabric fell flawlessly against my frame, radiating absolute, uncompromising wealth and executive power. My hair was styled with immaculate precision. I wore diamond stud earrings that caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courthouse. I carried a sleek black leather portfolio under my right arm. I looked exactly like what I was: a highly successful, incredibly wealthy corporate chief executive officer who was completely accustomed to destroying hostile threats. Ms. Davis walked a half step behind me, her presence amplifying the sheer intimidation of our entrance. I walked into the room, my heels clicking sharply, rhythmically against the linoleum floor. The sound was deafening in the sudden, absolute silence that had fallen over the mediation room. I did not look at the floor. I did not look at the ceiling. I kept my eyes locked in a dead, unblinking stare straight ahead. I walked right past the back row. The pastor's mouth physically dropped open, his eyes bulging as he recognized the woman he had tried to spiritually manipulate over the phone. I walked right past my mother. Brenda's tissue fell out of her trembling hand, fluttering uselessly to the floor. The fake tears instantly dried up, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. I walked right past Tasha. Her grip on her flashy designer bag loosened, her eyes wide as she took in the $3,000 Tom Ford suit, instantly calculating the sheer monetary value of my clothing and realizing she was entirely out of her league. I walked right past Darius. The golden child shrank back in his chair, his cheap gray suit suddenly looking exactly like the costume it was. His arrogant smirk vanished, wiped away by a sudden, terrifying wave of confusion. And finally, I walked right past Calvin. My father froze, his hand completely paralyzed on top of his gold-embossed Bible. His chest stopped heaving. His breathing hitched. He stared at me as if a ghost had just materialized in the center of the courthouse. He could not comprehend why his discarded, supposedly broken daughter had just walked through the doors dressed like a corporate titan. I did not say a single word to any of them. I did not acknowledge their gasps, their stares, or their overwhelming confusion. I simply pulled out the heavy wooden chair directly across from my father, the chair designated specifically for the plaintiff, the chair designated for the landlord. I sat down in the plaintiff's chair, crossed my legs smoothly, placed my leather portfolio on the table, and finally looked my father dead in the eye. The silence in the mediation room was so absolute, so dense, that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a judge's gavel striking the wood. My father stared at me from across the table. His eyes darted from the pristine cut of my Tom Ford suit to the heavy leather portfolio resting under my fingertips. His brain was violently rejecting the image in front of him. He was trying to force the reality of a powerful corporate executive back into the mold of the obedient, discarded daughter he had kicked out into the rain just days ago. "Maya, what on earth do you think you are doing?" Calvin hissed. His voice was a harsh, commanding whisper, meant to put me back in my place without alerting the mediator to his panic. "Get out of that chair. That side of the table is reserved for the opposing counsel. You are making a fool of yourself in front of the court. Sit in the back row with the pastor before you embarrass this family any further." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my gaze locked directly onto his face. The absolute lack of submission in my posture made his eye twitch. Mr. Calvin, the mediator, interrupted, peering over his reading glasses. The mediator looked highly unamused by my father's attempt to control the room. "Do you know this woman? She is my daughter." Calvin snapped, his face flushing with a mix of anger and deep humiliation. "She is having some sort of emotional breakdown. We had a minor family disagreement over the weekend, and she has apparently decided to follow us down to the courthouse to throw a tantrum. I apologize for the disruption, sir. I will have her removed so we can wait for the actual landlord to arrive." My attorney, Ms. Davis, stepped forward. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she approached the table. She opened her own briefcase with a swift, aggressive motion and pulled out a stack of legally certified watermarked documents. She did not look at my father. She addressed the mediator with the lethal bored efficiency of an apex predator. "There will be no removal, and we are not waiting for anyone," Ms. Davis stated clearly, her voice slicing through Calvin's arrogant assumption. She slid the heavy stack of documents directly across the table, positioning them right in front of the mediator. The mediator picked up the top document, his eyes scanning the certified corporate registration. "My client Maya is the sole owner and chief executive officer of Onyx Holdings, LLC." Ms. Davis announced, her voice echoing off the sterile walls of the courthouse room. "She holds 100% of the controlling shares. She is the legal registered owner of the historic brownstone property in question. We are the plaintiff. We are the landlord. And we are here to enforce the 30-day eviction notice served to the unauthorized occupants currently sitting across from us." The physical reaction from my family was something I will remember for the rest of my life. Calvin's jaw dropped. The gold-embossed Bible slipped from beneath his hand and hit the table with a dull thud. His skin turned a sickly ashen color as the blood completely drained from his face. He stared at Ms. Davis, then at me, then back at the mediator, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Darius physically recoiled in his cheap gray suit. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. His eyes darted wildly to the corporate documents in the mediator's hands. The arrogant smirk he had worn since Sunday dinner evaporated, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man who suddenly realizes the floor beneath him has vanished. Tasha gasped out loud. Her hands flew to her mouth. She looked at my $3,000 suit, and the horrifying realization washed over her features. The faceless billionaire corporate vulture she had spent 3 days crying about on Facebook Live was sitting right across from her. The mediator reviewed the documents, checking the watermarks and the digital signatures. He nodded slowly, stacking the papers neatly. "The documentation is in order," the mediator confirmed, looking up at my father. "Onyx Holdings, LLC, is the verified legal owner of the property. Ms. Maya is the authorized representative. We may proceed with the mediation." Suddenly, Brenda launched out of her chair. She threw her hands up in the air, attempting to deploy the exact same manipulative tactics she used in the kitchen. She plastered a loud, nervous laugh across her face, trying to shrink the massive legal crisis back down into a manageable domestic squabble. "Oh, praise the Lord," Brenda laughed, though the sound was shrill and borderline hysterical. "This is all just a big misunderstanding." "Sir," my mother said, looking desperately at the mediator, "Maya is just playing a silly prank on her father. She is upset because we asked her to move to a different bedroom for the new baby. You know how daughters can get when they feel left out. She is just throwing a tantrum to get our attention. She would never actually evict her own parents." We are a strong Black family. We resolve our issues at the dinner table, not in a courtroom. Tell him, Maya. Tell him you are dropping this foolishness right now. I did not even blink. I just stared at the woman who had watched her daughter-in-law throw my children's belongings into the trash. The mediator slammed his hand flat against the table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, instantly silencing my mother's nervous laughter. "Ma'am, sit down and be quiet," the mediator commanded, his voice dripping with severe judicial authority. "This is a court-ordered mediation. There are no pranks being played in my room. You are facing a legal eviction for a $0 lease violation. Your landlord has filed the proper paperwork to reclaim her property. If you cannot treat these proceedings with the seriousness they require, I will rule in favor of the plaintiff immediately and authorize the sheriff to execute the lockout today." Brenda dropped back into her chair as if her legs had given out. The reality of the law had just entirely crushed her church lady manipulations. There was no gaslighting a county mediator. There was no weaponizing my status as a strong Black woman in a room governed entirely by contracts, deeds, and property rights. Tasha began to panic. She turned to Darius, grabbing his arm and shaking it. "Darius, do something," Tasha hissed loudly. "She owns the house. You told me your dad was giving you the deed today. You told me we were safe. Say something to her." Darius could not speak. He was practically hyperventilating, staring at me with the wide, terrified eyes of a cornered animal. Calvin's shock finally mutated into absolute volcanic rage. The veins in his neck bulged, his face turned a deep, furious shade of purple. He realized that the narrative he had carefully constructed for decades was being publicly dismantled. He realized he was not the king of his castle. He was just a squatter living on his daughter's charity. "You deceitful, wicked woman!" Calvin screamed, his voice shaking with violent anger. He pointed a trembling finger at me across the table. "You lied to me. You let me stand up in front of my entire congregation and praise the Lord for saving our home, knowing you were the one holding the deed. You tricked me into taking your money. You stole my legacy. You stole the house my grandfather built. You are an agent of the devil, Maya. You stole my legacy to punish your brother." I leaned forward slowly. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood of the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to dominate the room. My absolute calm was 1,000 times more lethal than his raging temper. I reached out and placed my hand on the thick black leather portfolio resting in front of me. I slid the heavy folder straight across the table. It stopped precisely halfway between us, directly in front of Calvin's trembling hands. "I did not steal it, Dad," I said, my voice cold, precise, and utterly terrifying. "I saved it from the bank 6 months ago when you were drowning in secret loans you hid from your wife. I bought the debt you could not pay. I cleared the taxes you ignored. I saved this family's legacy." I paused, letting my gaze shift from my father's purple face directly to Darius's terrified, sweating complexion. "But you are about to hand it over to a thief," I stated. Calvin frowned, his rage momentarily broken by sheer confusion. He looked from the black folder on the table to Darius, then back to me. "A thief," Calvin demanded. "What are you talking about? Darius is my son. He is the heir. He was going to protect this house." Darius suddenly lunged forward. He slammed his hands onto the table, desperately trying to grab the black leather folder before Calvin could touch it. "Maya, shut up." Darius yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Do not open that. Dad, do not look at whatever she brought. She is lying. She is just trying to frame me because she is jealous. Do not open it." Ms. Davis stepped forward and slammed her hand down on top of the folder, completely blocking Darius from snatching it away. She shot him a warning glare that made him shrink back into his chair instantly. "You want to talk about protecting the family legacy, Dad?" I asked, my voice rising just enough to command the total attention of the room. "You threw my children out into the rain because you believed your golden child was going to elevate the family name. You thought giving him the deed was a brilliant financial move. You were willing to sacrifice your daughter to enable your son." I reached over and flipped the cover of the black leather portfolio open. "Let us look at exactly what your golden child was planning to do with your precious legacy the very second you handed him the deed." I pulled out a thick stack of printed emails financial statements, and digital loan applications. The documents were stamped with bright red urgent headers. The offshore crypto lending logos were clearly visible on the top of the pages. At the very bottom of the documents, bold and undeniable, was the digital signature of Darius. The entire room sucked in a collective breath. The pastor, sitting in the back row, leaned forward, his eyes locked onto the aggressive red warning stamps on the loan applications. Tasha let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. Brenda stared at the papers, her face frozen in absolute horror. I laid the documents out across the table, exposing the golden child to the searing, unforgiving light of the truth. I picked up the top sheet of paper, lifting it so the harsh fluorescent lighting of the mediation room illuminated the bold offshore lending logos. I cleared my throat, ensuring my voice carried to every single corner of the room. Application for hard money equity extraction. I read aloud, my tone clinical and detached. Applicant name Darius. Requested loan amount $250,000. Collateral listed the historic brownstone property currently deeded to Calvin. Interest rate an absolutely staggering 15% compounding monthly. Disbursement instructions. Direct wire transfer to a Cayman Islands digital currency exchange. I set the paper back down and slid a second document forward. And here's the digital communication log between Darius and the loan originators. I continued tapping my manicured nail against the printed text. Quote, "My father is signing the deed over to me on Monday. The property is completely unencumbered. I will execute the cash-out refinance by Wednesday to clear my margin calls." End quote. I looked directly at my father. Calvin looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His eyes were wide, completely bloodshot, staring at the printed emails as if they were written in an alien language. His brain was desperately trying to process the catastrophic reality. "He was not going to protect your legacy, Dad," I stated, delivering the final fatal blow to his patriarchal delusion. "He was going to leverage the house the exact second you handed him the deed. He was going to take $250,000 in predatory cash, wire it offshore to pay off his illegal crypto debts, and completely default on the monthly payments. He was going to let the bank foreclose on the brownstone and leave you and Mom completely homeless." Calvin slowly turned his head. The motion was stiff, robotic, like his spine had completely fused together. He looked at the golden child, the son he had praised, the son he had prioritized over me and my children. "Darius," Calvin whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual booming authority. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me right now that your sister fabricated these papers." Darius could not look at him. The arrogant, untouchable heir apparent completely crumbled. His shoulders collapsed inward, the cheap gray suit bunching up around his neck. He buried his face in his trembling hands. "I had to do it, Dad." Darius sobbed, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed miserably in the quiet mediation room. "The crypto market crashed. They were threatening me. They said they were going to garnish everything I ever owned. You were going to mortgage my house," Calvin shouted, the betrayal finally igniting a raw, devastated panic in his chest. "You were going to let the bank throw your mother and me out onto the street." "I just needed one big win," Darius cried out, lifting his tear-streaked face. He pointed a shaking finger toward the ceiling, desperately trying to justify his staggering financial treason. "I just needed to pull the equity out, to clear my debts, and then I was going to invest the rest into a new decentralized finance project. It was guaranteed to triple in value. I was going to buy the house back, Dad. I swear. I just wanted to be a man. I just wanted to be a provider like you. I wanted to give Tasha the life she deserved without asking you for money." The mention of Tasha's name acted like a detonator. Tasha had been sitting perfectly still, her hands resting on her pregnant belly, her eyes locked onto the loan documents displaying the $250,000 deficit. Her mind was rapidly crunching the numbers. There was no historic brownstone. There was no family legacy. There was no vast hidden wealth. Her husband was not a misunderstood entrepreneur on the verge of a massive breakthrough. He was a broke, desperate fraud drowning in $250,000 of offshore high-interest debt. Tasha stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the linoleum floor. "You are broke!" Tasha shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that made the mediator physically flinch. "You lied to me!" Darius reached out, trying to grab her hand. "Baby, please, I can fix this. We just need to figure out a new plan." Tasha violently snatched her hand away, slapping his arm in the process. The mask of the loyal, supportive, distressed pregnant wife completely disintegrated. The sweet church-going facade melted away, revealing the ruthless, opportunistic reality of her character. "Do not touch me!" Tasha screamed, her face contorting in absolute disgust. "You told me you were taking over a multi-million-dollar estate today. You told me we were getting the second floor. You told me your stupid crypto investments were just temporarily tied up in escrow. You are $250,000 in debt to loan sharks." "Tasha, think of the baby," Brenda pleaded, finally finding her voice, attempting to salvage the rapidly disintegrating family unit. "We are a family. We stick together through thick and thin." Tasha whipped her head around and glared at my mother with pure venom. "You can stick together in a cardboard box, Brenda. I am not ruining my credit and raising my child in a shelter because your son is a fraud." Tasha grabbed her flashy designer handbag off the table, clutching it like a life preserver. She looked down at Darius, who was openly weeping at the table. "I am calling my mother to come pick me up," Tasha declared, her tone completely devoid of any affection. "Do not bother coming back to our apartment, Darius. I am packing your cheap suits and garbage bags the second I get home, just like I did to your sister's kids." Tasha spun on her designer heels and stormed out of the mediation room. She threw the heavy oak door open and marched down the courthouse hallway, not looking back once. She had secured the ultimate exit, leaving the golden child crying and utterly abandoned at the defense table. The sound of the door slamming shut felt like a physical shockwave. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the leather portfolio. I watched my father stare at the empty space where his daughter-in-law had just stood. His legacy was in ashes. His son was a humiliated, bankrupt fraud. His family was completely destroyed entirely by their own hands. But the execution was not over yet. In the back row of the mediation room, Reverend Williams slowly stood up. The senior pastor smoothed the front of his tailored suit jacket. His face was a mask of profound, unadulterated disgust. He walked slowly toward the long wooden table, stopping right behind Calvin's chair. Calvin looked up, his eyes pleading for spiritual backup. "Pastor," Calvin whispered desperately, "the devil is attacking this family today. Please pray for us. Pray for my daughter's hardened heart." The pastor looked down at Calvin. He looked at the gold-embossed Bible sitting uselessly on the table. Then he looked directly at me. I maintained eye contact, my expression calm and unyielding. The pastor finally understood the absolute truth of our phone conversation on Sunday afternoon. "The devil is not attacking this family, Calvin," the pastor said, his deep, resonant voice echoing with severe disappointment. "The rot came from inside your own house." Calvin flinched, as if he had been physically struck. "Pastor, please. You stood in front of my congregation." The pastor interrupted, his tone rising with righteous anger. "You stood before God and hundreds of faithful people and you lied. You asked us to pray for your daughter's hardened heart, claiming she was a greedy woman abandoning you to corporate vultures. All the while you were enabling a son who was actively trying to sell the roof over your head. You manipulated the church, Calvin. You manipulated me to try and extort money from the very woman who actually saved you." The pastor shook his head, a gesture of absolute final condemnation. "You are a prideful, deceptive man," the pastor declared, looking down at Calvin with pity. "Do not return to the elder board on Sunday. You are no longer fit to serve." The pastor turned, gave me a brief, respectful nod, acknowledging his own misjudgment, and walked out of the mediation room. Calvin broke. He slumped forward, burying his face in his arms, his entire body shaking. He had lost everything. He had lost his house, his son's future, his daughter-in-law, and now he had lost his supreme social standing in the church. The pride that had fueled his tyranny for decades was completely obliterated. The mediator cleared his throat, shuffling his paperwork to break the heavy silence. Given the evidence presented and the plaintiff's valid documentation of ownership, I am authorizing the eviction to proceed. The defendants have zero legal standing to contest. It was over. The legal victory was absolute. I stood up from the plaintiff's chair. I smoothly buttoned the jacket of my Tom Ford suit, picked up my black leather portfolio, and turned to leave. Maya, wait. The voice was desperate, frantic, and dripping with tears. I stopped and looked back. My mother Brenda pushed herself up from the table. Her lavender Sunday suit looked rumpled, her perfect composure entirely shattered. She stumbled around the edge of the table, reaching out her hands toward me, as if she were reaching for a savior. She was weeping genuine, terrified tears. The reality of impending homelessness had finally pierced her wall of delusion. Maya, please! Brenda begged, her voice cracking as she clasped her hands together in front of her chest. Please do not do this. You have made your point. Your father is broken. Darius is ruined. You won, sweetheart. You proved you are the smartest one in the family. Just call off the eviction. I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. We have nowhere to go, Brenda sobbed, stepping closer. We cannot afford an apartment on such short notice. We will be on the street. Maya, you have a beautiful penthouse. You have millions of dollars. You do not need this brownstone. Just let us stay. When I did not immediately answer, Brenda resorted to the only tactic she had left. She reached into her psychological arsenal and pulled out the very weapon she had used to keep me in line for over 3 decades. You are a strong black woman, Maya. Brenda pleaded, her tears flowing freely down her cheeks. God gave you this strength for a reason. He gave you this wealth so you could carry the family. We need you to carry this burden just one more time. Please, baby, be the strong one, for your mother. I looked at the woman who had watched Tasha throw my son's beloved toys into the trash. I looked at the woman who had told me to accept a damp, freezing basement so her golden child could have a luxury suite. I looked at the woman who had demanded I empty my bank account to fund their lies. I adjusted the grip on my leather portfolio. I locked my eyes onto hers, ensuring she saw the absolute, unbreakable finality in my gaze. I carried it for 34 years, Mom, I replied, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of mercy. My back is tired. Brenda let out a small, devastated gasp, her hands dropping to her sides. The eviction stands, I stated, delivering the final fatal verdict. You have 48 hours to vacate my property. I turned my back on my weeping mother, my broken father, and my ruined brother. I walked out of the mediation room with Ms. Davis at my side. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind us, closing the book on my biological family forever. Exactly 48 hours later, 2 Fulton County Sheriff deputies pulled their cruisers up to the curb of the historic brownstone. They walked up the stone steps and banged heavily on the thick oak door. I watched the entire execution of the lockout through the live feed of the security cameras I had quietly installed on the property months ago. Calvin and Brenda were forced to carry their hastily packed cardboard boxes out onto the sidewalk in the glaring light of day. There was no corporate angel coming to save them. The neighbors, the very people my parents had spent decades trying to impress with their curated perfection, stood on their porches and watched the humiliating spectacle unfold. My parents packed their remaining belongings into the back of a rented moving truck and drove away to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The physical downgrade was devastating, but it was nothing compared to the social obliteration they faced. Reverend Williams kept his word. Calvin was formally asked to step down from his position as a church elder. The congregation, having learned the absolute truth about his predatory financial behavior and his staggering hypocrisy, completely turned their backs on him. The immaculate righteous image my father had worshipped above his own children was entirely and permanently shattered. The collapse of the golden child was even more spectacular. Tasha did exactly what she promised in the mediation room. She filed for divorce the very next morning, packed up her designer bags, and moved right back into her mother's house. She cited irreconcilable financial differences and completely washed her hands of the sinking ship she had married into. Without the brownstone to leverage, and without my mother's secret financial bailouts to act as a buffer, Darius was left entirely exposed to the offshore crypto lenders. They seized his bank accounts, liquidated his remaining digital assets, and immediately garnished his wages. He was forced to sell the luxury car he could never afford and pawn the heavy gold Rolex my mother had bought him. Today, the arrogant heir to the family legacy clocks in at 4 in the morning to work a minimum wage job at a massive distribution warehouse just outside the city limits. He spends his days hauling heavy cardboard boxes, sweating through cheap uniforms, and turning over his meager paychecks to ruthless debt collectors. The unearned arrogance has been completely stripped away, leaving behind a broken man who finally has to pay for his own catastrophic mistakes. I did not keep the brownstone. The house held too many ghosts, too many echoes of conditional love and systematic exploitation. Once the property was completely vacated and professionally cleaned, I listed it on the real estate market. Thanks to the extensive high-quality renovations I had funded, the historic property sparked a massive bidding war among wealthy corporate developers. I sold the house for a staggering profit, walking away with a return on my investment that exceeded my wildest financial expectations. But I did not absorb that money into my personal accounts. I used the entire profit from the sale to establish a new philanthropic foundation called the Onyx STEM Initiative. I built a comprehensive educational program entirely dedicated to funding tuition, providing professional mentorship, and supplying advanced technological resources for young Black girls in the Atlanta area. I created the foundation with one specific ironclad mission. I wanted to ensure that these brilliant young minds would grow up to be completely financially independent. I wanted to equip them with the skills and the capital to build their own fortresses, ensuring they would never have to depend on toxic family structures or manipulative patriarchs to survive. I turned the very house that was used to oppress me into a financial engine that would liberate generations of young women to come. I am sitting on the sprawling glass balcony of my downtown penthouse, wrapping a soft cashmere blanket around my shoulders as the cool evening breeze rolls off the Atlanta skyline. The sun is setting, casting a brilliant array of orange and purple light across the city. Inside the living room, I can hear the beautiful, uninterrupted sound of my children laughing. Malik and Nia are playing a video game together, their faces lit up with pure, unburdened joy. They are thriving, completely safe and entirely free from the heavy, suffocating expectations of a grandfather who only saw their value based on their gender. People often say that blood is thicker than water. Society conditions us to believe that we owe our families infinite chances, endless financial bailouts, and unshakable loyalty simply because we share the same DNA. But I learned the hardest way possible that blood does not equate to loyalty. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to exploit your hard work, dismiss your boundaries, or treat you as a disposable resource. Walking away from the people who raised you is a terrifying concept, but sometimes it is the only way to save yourself. Walking away from people who only view you as an endless supply of money and demand, your unconditional submission, is not a tragedy. It is the ultimate act of self-love. It is the purest form of survival. I lost my biological family, but I gained the absolute ownership of my own life, and I will never apologize for building a castle and refusing to hand over the keys.